essentially the message about sign tracking and inhibition is that inhibition, Pavlovian inhibition, can be very visible in a sign tracking context. So there's the cue. If it's an excitatory cue for something good, the animal will approach it. If it's not associated with anything, the animal will locomote or stand or locate itself without respect to the cue. If the cue is an inhibitory cue that says, you would normally get something good in this cage, in this circumstance, but in the presence of that cue you're not, they move away from it. They get away from it. There's another circumstance under which we can see inhibition, which is a summation test. So this is the same kind of thing. A key light has been associated with the US. A tone has been associated with the absence of the US. So it's kind of like this causes salivation. This doesn't cause any salivation, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning. If you present them both together, the tone reduces the amount of salivation that you get. Right? So you can only see the inhibition produced by the tone in the presence of another cue that predicts the US. And you see it, and this is the measure of inhibition. Right? How much the animal would normally salivate this much in response to the key light, but in the presence of the tone, he only salivates half that much. That's the inhibition working right there. And this idea of predicting nothing is super important in dog training. I think what I'm going to do is skip this view. This is an alternate view of inhibition. If anybody wants to see kind of another schematic to try to get the idea across, then I can show you this sort of offline. And then this is, actually I went two, yeah. So there's one version of it. Here's another. It's just another way of getting this idea across, and also a little bit of the theoretical content behind inhibition. But it gets us here. So we've been talking about this weird phenomenon. I think we've already talked a little bit about its relevance to dog training. But initially you can have the thought, inhibition is a weird thing to do. I'm never going to do anything as complex as that in dog training. And my message is, yes, you will. We already talked about one example, which, do you ever say wrong to your dog in a context of frequent administration of positive reinforcement? Like in this training room, he expects to get fed for doing this and that and the other thing. He emits a behavior that is not precisely right, or you've changed your criterion a little bit, so what used to be right isn't going to be right anymore. He executes the behavior, and you indicate to him, no, that's not criterion anymore. You're not going to get paid for that. That's Pavlovian inhibition. That is Pavlovian inhibition at work in your dog training. Same thing if you're using electric collar, for instance, to add pressure to your dog moving away from you to a target. And if the dog on cue moves quickly to a target, makes contact with the target, my advice would be you don't just let his consciousness of having emitted that behavior give him the information that no shock is forthcoming. You should also signal to him that no shock is forthcoming with a cue. The cue I use is the word good, which means it's a safety cue. No shock is coming. The moment all four of your feet are in contact with that target, safety cue. That's Pavlovian inhibition. And how does so we already talked about how a dog feels about a cue for no ball or no food. He feels bad. How does a dog feel about a cue for no electric collar or no other hedonic aversive? He likes it. And you can show they'll approach it. So if this cue right here means no punishment, they track it. They'll press a lever to produce it. It becomes reinforced saying.
Perform work. Yeah.
Right? And then the last one is, have you ever tried to extinguish fear or anxiety in your dog? Like, is there any emotional responding or any kind of responding that your dog's ever shown that you thought was undesirable, and so what you're going to do is extinguish it? Everybody know what extinction is. Extinction is, in the case of Pavlovian conditioning, extinction is when you present the CS many, many, many times without ever presenting the US, so that the CS loses its meaning. And eventually the CR diminishes to nothing. In the case of instrumental conditioning, that's giving the command again and again and again and again without presenting the consequence. like food or the ball, right? That is extinction. Guess what? Pavlovian inhibition is involved in extinction. So if you're carrying out any of these operations, you are making use of and experiencing the effects of Pavlovian inhibition. So essentially the question is, if I carry out an extinction procedure, if my dog is, for instance, afraid of, here's a good thing. So let's say my dog is afraid of the noise that a crate door makes. And that just starts the whole thing off. Like he got afraid of the crate because he's sensitive and a crate door, and now I can't get him near the crate because so I'm going to start by extinguishing fear of the noise of the crate door, right? So I bring him in the room and I just make a little noise with the crate door. Make a little noise again. Do that 10 times, take him out of the room. Next day, I do the same thing again. I do that many, many, many times until he's no longer looking like this when the crate door makes its noise. And now I'm on the way of extinguishing fear of crates. But here's what I can show. Go out in your backyard or on your back porch. Put your crate out there. Make the same noise. What you'll often experience or see is reinstatement of fear. Because what happens is that the context in which you extinguished the behavior controls that inhibition of fear. You have not made the association between the crate door and fear go away. All you've done is put another layer of learning over the top of it, an inhibitory layer of learning. When you change context, the cues that control that layer of inhibition go away and fear reemerges.
Which is why dog-reactive dogs or people-reactive dogs.
Yes.
Many pictures.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's
really
one reason. It's one reason that extinction of fear responses and aggression responses proceeds so slowly, and you see so much recovery if you change anything.
You go way back if they have a burst.
Yeah, and the basic message is, to an extent, we can say if the animal has a really profound fear response to some stimulus, you can do all kinds of stuff, and that response is more or less permanent. It's there. You may submerge it under other layers of conditioning, but you haven't abolished it. You haven't made it go away. This is a fundamental technical problem in dog training that we all experience that is driven by the mechanisms of Pavlovian conditioning. The limitations, the constraints of Pavlovian conditioning. Essentially, excitatory conditioning is not very context dependent. If I make a dog feel good about a cue because I feed him in this room, once I've done that, I can take him outside and present that cue, and he'll probably feel good about the cue out there. If I extinguish fear in this room, it's specific to this room. When I move to another place, fear is likely to reemerge. And this has, and for instance, there is, ever since global war on terror, there's enormous concern for PTSD and veterans who experience all kinds of terrors and traumas and stuff like that. Standard thing is extinguish their fear, which is done in a clinician's office. And if you're extinguishing, fear in response to loud noises, and you get them nicely extinguished in the guy's office, don't be fucking surprised if the patient is walking to his car and there's a backfire from another car and he has a shit fit, because the context is different. And fear of noises is not inhibited by cues of context that drive inhibition.
There's a whole bunch of examples that we'll get into of inhibitory Pavlovian inhibition affecting all kinds of things we do in dog training. Once you start really thinking about it, and sometimes the cues are purposeful, like an omission cue. Sometimes they're context driven and they're a common problem with getting dogs ready for competitions, right? All sorts of things around a competition can become signals for Pavlovian inhibition. For omission cues, like when there's a guy with a clipboard following me around, I don't get rewarded, right? Like when there's an audience here, like when you start getting nervous and behave this way, all those things have the potential, with enough experience, to become inhibitory signals and changing your dog's behavior as a result of it, right? And if you start looking at dog training across a wide range of things, you can just come up with infinite examples of this happening.